There's an app for everything, and I couldn't believe there wasn't a simple app where I could advertise my food and people living nearby who wanted it could request it and pop round and pick it up.
There's this misconception that if you're doing impact, you can't do something that is commercially viable.
As a female co-founded tech for good pre-revenue / early revenue business, fundraising has been absolutely brutal. I learned pretty early on, one, figure out how to deal with just an awful lot of no's. Two, how to look for what I refer to as conviction-based investors.
You left a very successful career path in the corporate world. When you were making that leap, what was some of the hardest things that you had to think through to make that jump?
Today, we are joined by Tessa Clarke, the co-founder of Olio, a community-driven app that tackles food waste by turning surplus into sharing. Olio's launched since 2015 now, so coming up on 10 years soon, and has grown to over 7 million users in more than 60 countries. Tessa's journey from senior leadership at Dyson to purpose-driven founder was sparked by deeply personal moments, which you would hear about. Really excited to have you today on the show, Tessa.
Thank you for inviting me.
So maybe we can kick it off for the benefits of our guests. How did you land on Olio? What was that aha moment that made you decide this is the problem and now I'm going to actually build a business around it?
Yeah, so there was a very clear light bulb moment. It took place just over 10 years ago. I was living and working outside of the UK and moving back. And when we were packing up the house, the removal men told me I had to throw away all of our uneaten food. And I grew up on a farm. And in my family, food waste was pretty much considered criminal. So I was not prepared to put perfectly good food in the bin. So instead, I bundled up my newborn baby and toddler. I set out into the streets, clutching this food, hoping to find someone to give it to. And unfortunately, I failed miserably. And I cried because I was under so much stress on such a busy day. And I went back to my apartment. And then when the removal men were in another room, I sneaked the non-perishable foods into the bottom of my packing boxes. And that was when I thought, Tessa, this is absolutely ridiculous. I know you hate food waste, but resorting to cross-border smuggling is a step too far. And why isn't there an app for that? I'd been working in the digital space for well over a decade. I knew there was an app for everything, and I couldn't believe there wasn't a simple app where I could advertise my food and people living nearby who wanted it could request it and pop round and pick it up.
I love that. Now, Tessa, you left a very successful career path in the corporate world. And so when you were making that leap to start the company, what was some of the hardest things that you had to think through to make that jump?
It's really interesting, actually, because for me, it didn't necessarily, I'd always assumed it would feel like a really big leap, but actually, due to my circumstances, it just felt like a whole sequence of really small sort of baby steps. And if we rewind a little bit, so I'd been working in the corporate space for, I think, about 15 or 17 years before founding Olio. In the last 4 or 5 years, I had a growing entrepreneurial itch. But I wasn't able to actually do anything and make it happen for a couple of reasons. One, because I didn't have an idea. And the second reason was I didn't honestly believe in myself. Entrepreneurship just seemed like this incredible, kind of inaccessible but wonderful thing, and it didn't feel like it was for someone like me. So I spent a couple of years as, I guess, what you'd call an aspiring entrepreneur. I've now realized that actually I went about that period of time in completely the wrong way. Instead of waiting for an idea to descend from the heavens, I should have actually opened my eyes and gone out into the world and just been looking for a problem that I wanted to solve and a problem that I was really passionate about. And if I was to do it again now, I'd probably honestly use the notes app in my phone or a notebook for 24 hours or a week and just write down every single problem I encountered and then start to think about the size of them and how passionate I am about solving them. So Olio came about not through having an idea, but through encountering a problem that really agitated me. And that was the problem of food waste. So obviously I had my own personal experience when moving house. But then when I researched the problem of food waste, what I discovered absolutely blew my brains. And I couldn't believe this wasn't on the front page of every newspaper. Along with my co-founder, Sasha, we uncovered that globally, a third of all the food we produce each year gets thrown away, which is worth over $1 trillion. That 800 million people go to bed hungry every night. And if food waste were to be a country, it would be the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after the USA and China. And as if all that weren't bad enough, we learned that in a country such as the UK, well over half of all food waste takes place in the home. And I share this detail with you because once you've uncovered a problem that is that big, that important, and then you can't see anyone doing anything about it, it removes the need for you to have courage to get started. You think, I have no option other than to do something to solve this problem because it's so enormous and I can't see anyone else doing anything about it. So it didn't feel like this sort of really big leap. It just felt like something that surely I have to do something about
Mm.
this. And I think that having a co-founder, Sasha, as well, made it a lot
Mm.
easier. And we've been incredible sort of partners on this journey for 10 years now. But that sort of big leap moment, there wasn't a
Yeah.
single big leap moment. It's like you can set up a company in the UK for, I think, £15 and it takes about 10 minutes. So actually, and then you just layer on lots of small baby steps after
And
that.
I'm curious, with your co-founder, Sasha, did they come to the decision at around the time you came to it? Was it
Mm-hmm.
like this natural, or was it a different, different times? How did that come about?
Yeah, so Sasha also, I think, had reached that point in her life and in her career where she knew that she wanted to do entrepreneurial work. So she, like me, had a long corporate career. She had actually, a couple of years earlier, co-founded a pay-as-you-go high street creche, and that had really given her the entrepreneurial bug. She really enjoyed creating a business from nothing, being master of her own destiny. And so when I told her about this problem that I wanted to solve, it was just really obvious to her that she wanted to join forces and help me do it.
And how did
Yeah.
the two of you meet? I'm always curious to hear how that matchmaking takes
Yeah.
place.
So we had met about 10 years prior to that, studying for our MBAs at Stanford Business School. We were sort of really, really firm friends. We partied a lot together. We then ended up having children at roughly the same time. And, sort of doing Olio together also felt like the right thing to do for both of us at the right time in our lives.
One of the things that, really interests me when I hear about, like, especially consumer marketplace startups, we have those labels now, but I'm sure then it was just, I just want to get people who have excess food to people who don't have enough.
Mhm.
What was the landscape like at the time? And maybe walk us through what the first product evolution, first few customers look like, from the idea to making it a bit more tangible. Maybe first paint the world to us, what
Yeah.
that looked like, and then the other.
Yeah, so we read two books really early on in our journey. One was The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and the other was The Mom Test by Rob Fitzpatrick. And I recommend both of them to everybody. So we had sort of read those books, drunk the Kool-Aid on both of them, and we therefore knew that rather than sort of racing off and building an app, what we needed to do was first do some market research. And so we did a survey, sent it out to everybody we knew, posted it all over social media. And we gathered lots of information about the problem of food waste in the home, but the core data point that really jumped out from that survey was the fact that 1 in 3 people told us they were physically pained throwing away good food. And that was a really powerful insight because we knew that food waste was a problem for
Mm.
society, but we didn't know whether it was a problem for people. And when 1 in 3 people tell you they're physically pained throwing away good food, and we use that deliberately extreme language to filter out sort of false positives, we're like, wow, it's not only a massive problem on paper, it's a really mainstream problem that impacts a lot of people, 1 in 3 people. But just because people said that they hated food waste didn't mean to say they'd take the next step in our hypothesis, which was to share food with a random stranger. And before we built an app to enable that, we wanted to find a way to test whether people would be prepared to share food with a stranger. And so what we did was we reached out to 12 people who had done that market research survey, who all said they hated food waste. They lived close to one another. They didn't know each other. We didn't know them. And we asked them to take part in an experiment. And what we did was we put them on a WhatsApp group for 2 weeks. And we said, if anyone has any spare food in the next 2 weeks, here's a group of people living nearby who might or might not be interested in it. So we launched that one weekend in April, and we waited with bated breath throughout the whole weekend. And then finally on a Monday morning, someone shared the first listing, which was half a net of shallots. And that was requested within 23 minutes. And thereafter, we had lots of items shared by that WhatsApp group. And at the end of the 2 weeks, we met and debriefed one on one with all of those participants. And they told us a couple of things. They said, you absolutely have to do this. They said, it only needs to be slightly better than a WhatsApp group. And
Mm.
that was some of the most powerful advice and guidance we've received on our journey. Like, you don't need any bells, you don't need any whistles. It just needs to be slightly better than WhatsApp. And the third thing they said is, how can I help? And that is what has resulted in today what is our ambassador program. But actually, those people played a really crucial role in helping us to solve that chicken and egg cold start problem that all marketplaces face.
I love that. And I think one thing that's come up in quite a lot of our episodes is just being super scrappy in the early days to
Yeah.
validate the problem that you're really trying to solve for. And you don't really need to go out and build a full blown app. And obviously, that's become a lot easier these days with
Yes.
some
Yeah.
of the vibe coding platforms and so on. You're obviously building a very mission driven startup. And you've managed to crack monetization. So I'm just curious, as you've grown, scaled Olio, how did you think about monetization without undermining user trust in the journey?
I smile when I think about our monetization journey. It has definitely been one heck of a roller coaster because unfortunately, there are no sort of playbooks that we can take off of the shelf. We have had to figure this all out from first principles, from the ground up, through an awful lot of experimentation. Now, initially, our philosophy was that we should not be focusing on monetization in the very early days because we knew that for Olio to work, because it was hyperlocal, it needed a large number of people using it. And because the average sort of item value that was being shared is very low, then in order to be able to monetize, the platform needs to be operating at significant scale. And so our objective in the early days was to build a product that people loved. And we only had 2 engineers in the very early days. So we wanted those 2 engineers focused on building a brilliant product, not focused on how do we monetize 100 people. So we were really focused on building out the product before we started to introduce monetization. And I'm really glad that we did that because many of our early hypotheses, if we had built those monetization models, would not have worked and we would have wasted our engineering time because the actual monetization model that we landed on is a model that came out of our product market fit efforts. And so we had a challenge in the early days, which was that our early adopters hated food waste. Therefore, they had no surplus food to give away. And we had hoped that local businesses like cafes, delis, bakeries would work with Olio to give away their spare croissants and sandwiches at the end of the day. But we quickly discovered that they were far too busy with their day-to-day operations to be messing about on an app, messaging with neighbours. And so we were a food sharing app with no food, which I'm sure you'll agree is pretty useless. So what we thought is, why don't we solve this by taking the people who have lots of time and no surplus food and match them with the businesses that have lots of surplus food and no time. And that created what is today our Food Waste Heroes program. And today we have over 140,000 volunteers. So these are members of our community who we recruit in the app. We train them on our online food safety management system. And then once they're trained up, they're called a food waste hero. And a food waste hero can then claim a collection slot. And a collection slot is an opportunity to go to a local business location, for example, your local supermarket, to pick up all of their unsold food, to take it home, to add it to the app and give it away to your neighbors for free. And we monetize by charging businesses for that service we provide. Because at the moment, businesses are having to pay waste contractors
Yeah.
to take that food off to waste streams. And instead, they now pay us, and we make sure that food is eaten by local families. And we share back with them all of their social and environmental impact. We do lots of co-marketing activities, etc. And so that is today how Olio generates the majority of our revenue. We are a SaaS business model, if you like. So our businesses pay us an amount per location per year to access the service and to use it as frequently as they would like.
That is so incredible because I think two things that's coming out is one, had you monetized earlier, you probably wouldn't have gotten that insight because the
No.
natural instinct would have been get the customers to pay or maybe pay a
Yeah.
percentage as is now common. So I think maybe for folks listening, especially if you're building models that are brand new, that don't have that path, maybe leave some room for more experimentation. And then the second thing is mirroring actual behavior in your monetization tactics, no matter how seemingly unconventional they may seem, because that insight allowed you just unlock an existing revenue slot. You're already
Yeah.
creating value. So that's super interesting. I would love to hear about the fundraising journey because I think that's the other side of delaying revenue generation. You need to be funded somehow. So tell us a
Yes.
little bit about how that was for you.
Yeah. So we knew that Olio was a business that would only generate significant revenues once we were at scale. And honestly, in the UK, that eliminates about 3/4 of all prospective investors, because UK investors are not the same as American investors. Generally, they want to see that you are revenue generating. Heck, they would even like to see you being profitable. And we knew that we were not that, and we were not going to be that for a long time. So that meant that we were fishing in sort of a much smaller pool of prospective investors, but it was really important for us to be very transparent about that upfront so as not to waste anybody's time. And the criteria that we sort of went to market with in terms of what we were looking for in terms of investors were a couple of things. First of all, we were looking for investors who are not just mission aligned, but mission obsessed. And that's
Mm.
actually a very high bar. And we've kept that bar high for our investors. I'm super pleased to say that all of our investors meet that criteria. And the reason why that was so important is because, as I said before, there was no playbook we could just pull down off the shelf and follow to implement and scale Olio. We have had to do so much testing and learning and iteration from first principles, from the ground up, which inevitably means things that take just a longer time. So we needed investors who were totally mission obsessed, who had truly patient capital, who were bought into the long term vision for the business. And then we were also always looking for investors who could add some significant value to Olio. So in particular, we have enjoyed having investors on our cap table who have marketplace expertise, scaling to multiple international markets, and then also impact investors who understand how to manage growing your impact whilst also growing your revenues at the same time. I would say that as a female co-founded tech for good pre-revenue slash early revenue business, fundraising has been absolutely brutal. There was nothing about Olio that appealed to pretty much anybody in the early days. And I learned pretty early on, one, to figure out how to deal with just an awful lot of no's, but two, how to look for what I refer to as conviction based investors. So these were investors who listened to their gut, to their instinct. They had their theses. They didn't suffer from FOMO. And again, there aren't that many conviction based investors. Generally, they were not first time, they were not early in their career. They were definitely not first time funds. And we found that certainly in the early days, our investors were disproportionately female.
Mm.
And I think that is because many male investors honestly didn't understand the problem that we were trying to solve. They were not close to the problem of food waste in their home. They were not particularly excited and engaged by the concept of a community based solution. And yeah, and that's why I'm very passionate about sort of banging the drum for increasing diversification amongst the gatekeepers of capital. Because so long as we have just the dominant demographic holding the purse strings, we're only going to get a tiny subset of businesses funded versus the ones that should be funded.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And I believe that's how we really move the needle in terms of the type of founders that we get backed and the products and services that we
Yeah.
build in the world going forward. Given that you're obviously building a value driven company whilst navigating scale, regulation, climate urgency, what's changed most about you as a founder since day one? What are some of the personal practices that have helped you along the journey and I guess kept you grounded and energized in the face of the pressure? Obviously, you mentioned your
Mm,
fundraising journey, but I'm sure there's been many other bumps and hurdles along the way, as is expected with any
yeah.
journey. So I'd love to hear how you've evolved as a leader.
I guess there are a couple of things. So, one really important thing has been a mindset shift. So, I remember in the early days, going to bed fantasizing about Instagram style hockey stick growth, or I guess what would be TikTok style growth or OpenAI style growth nowadays, and being genuinely surprised that this was not happening for us because we had built such a brilliant solution to such an enormous problem. What I have now learned is that there is no such thing as a silver bullet. And certainly, I know that Sasha and I spent a very long time thinking that the next marketing campaign, the next senior hire, the next raise, that was the one that was going to unlock hockey stick growth. And the reality is, it doesn't work like that. You've just got to keep on, there is no silver bullet. You've just got to keep on layering on lots of lead bullets. I think the other thing is you've got to be able to kind of stay in the game And so we have been incredibly frugal with regards to how we have deployed any capital that we have raised. And that means that we've been able to last and survive, perhaps when many other startups haven't. They just sort of went for that explosive growth, blew all their capital, and then hit a wall hard. Whereas we've always managed our capital really very carefully. And then because entrepreneurship really is, they say sort of it's a marathon, not a sprint. I'd go further than that and say it's a series of marathons, not a sprint. Given that you have got to have oodles of resilience, and the single most important thing I have found to build my resilience, and I know that Sasha does the same, is that after we've dropped off the kids at school, we really, really sort of religiously ring fence that first hour of the day from 9 till 10 for personal time, for exercise, whether it be a class or a walk or a run or a workout. We'll often listen to podcasts, and that's when we have our highest quality thinking, our breakthroughs. But also, it then means that you're set up for the day just with super high energy levels that can then take you through.
It's so interesting that you talk about like the physical health part. It's one that it doesn't get a lot of attention. We've had a few founders touch on it, but I would also love to hear maybe some of your advice managing that energy and momentum. You mentioned earlier that you're going to get a lot of no's. It's a series of marathon, not just sprints.
Yeah.
Are there any specific tips, tactics similar to the exercise one you've shared that's helped you more on the mental side, like that
Yeah.
mental resilience when things
Yeah.
get really hard? What's worked in your from your experience?
It's another mindset one, but it is recognizing that no matter how sort of bad things are or how dark things feel, there is always something good around the corner. And it's so funny because even 10 years in, we've been through a patch recently where just things have not been going how we want them to be. And it's really impacted how Sasha and I feel. And then just this morning, we just got some amazing, fantastic news. And it was such a reminder to me that when you're in just the deepest, darkest depths, it's really easy to lose faith. But when you've been through this cycle as many times as we have, you sort of learn that there will be an up again. And you just almost got to kind of hold the faith a little bit. And I think that's really important to keeping your mental health in a good place.
Got it. I would love to talk about the peculiarities of building a consumer product specifically and the
Mm-hmm.
marketplace because we have listeners who are building consumer products. They're building consumer marketplaces as well. Maybe thinking of doing it. Based, I guess maybe reflecting back, what were some of the advice that maybe or the conventional wisdom that you probably leaned on, but then very quickly found that didn't work in real life that you could maybe pass
Mm.
on to our listeners? And then also, I remember there was a time when we spoke when I was doing my MBA, I was considering building like a consumer app for MBA students. And I remember you said something around like, look, even like community management of just even content moderation is an issue in and of itself in consumer
Mhm.
apps. And I remember you were absolutely right. So there are particular nuances of consumer apps, marketplaces where the communication is happening on the app. Maybe tell us a little bit about some conventional wisdom that you took into it that proved otherwise,
Mhm.
or things that you learned along the way.
Yeah, so a couple of ones on that. So the first thing around marketplaces, they are renowned for being amongst the hardest businesses to build because you have to balance supply and demand. And that immediately means that you have to split your focus between these two things. And I would say it's absolutely crucial to figure out as quickly as you can for your marketplace which is the constraint. And so for us, we learned really early on that, and this is quite counterintuitive actually, because most people assume that we'd have a problem with demand. Who wants to go and pick up free food from a neighbour's house? Turns out there is no shortage of people who want to get free stuff. So our biggest challenge has been supply. And it's been really important to get that insight for your marketplace and then stay really focused on that. And for many marketplaces, although not all, supply is king. Supply is the constraint, and you need to really focus on that. But you should be able to answer that question for your marketplace specifically. A piece of conventional wisdom that we ended up completely ignoring was around geographic focus. And a lot of people would cite the Deliveroo model of staying focused on just one postcode. And for us, we found pretty early on that because Olio was trying to drive a behavior change and a really brand new behavior change, actually we needed to expand Olio beyond a tiny geographic restriction and make it a little bit broader, because the demand in the early days was actually prepared to travel to pick up the surplus food. And so by enabling Olio to go London wide much more quickly than you would expect, it actually led to a more successful marketplace, because believe it or not, in the early days, people would travel from South London to North London to pick up surplus food. And
Mm.
then another example of that was around international expansion. So again, sort of the received wisdom is that you need to pick a single market and really focus on it and double down on it. And I will never forget the day when I was sort of in the App Store. This was really early on. I think it was sort of within the first 2 years. And we'd had people reaching out to us from all over the world saying, please bring Olio to our country. And Sasha and I realized just we weren't ever going to be able to have the bandwidth to do that, but we invested quite a lot of effort in building an ambassador program, which enabled people to kind of essentially get Olio going in their local community. And so on that day, I was just like, do you know what? Screw it. There's a box in the App Store which just says sort of, select all, and it makes your app live in all countries immediately. And I just sort of did it. And that's definitely counter conventional wisdom. But what was really powerful about that was that prior to that moment, we had assumed that for international expansion, being a UK based company, we would probably go to France, maybe Germany. If we raise a lot of money, we'd go to the US. But actually, we saw real data. We saw where people were organically not just downloading the app, but using the app. And actually, our most active international market is Singapore. And
Oh,
we have over 200,000 people using
wow.
Olio in Singapore. Now, who would have known? We wouldn't have chosen Singapore as our first international market on the basis of a bunch of desk research. And similarly in Latin America, so Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Argentina, we've got hundreds of thousands of people using Olio there, which meant that we translated the app into Spanish pretty early on. So I think that's an example of us ignoring conventional wisdom. And when you're on your entrepreneurial journey, you will have lots of people giving you advice. You need to listen to all of that advice, interrogate that advice, and then decide what advice resonates and what advice you're going to put to one side, because no one knows your business better than you.
I love that. And I think, like you said, sometimes it just comes back to that founder instinct, and you
Yeah,
can't always follow playbooks, right? Sometimes you just have to really go with that innate
yeah,
feeling in terms of when it comes to key decisions in particular. One thing that I'm curious about, because you mentioned that on the B2B side, it's a SaaS model essentially that you use.
yeah,
And I know that when it comes to SaaS, pricing is oftentimes a big challenge for
yeah.
companies whereby you're potentially leaving too much money on the table, or you go into these conversations, you lay down your price, and the corporates just don't bat an eyelid, and you're kind of like, huh, could have priced it higher.
Mm.
How did you think about pricing? I mean, I guess it's a journey as opposed to like a static decision that you
Yeah.
make. Yeah, just love to hear your perspective on that.
It is. So again, because we are doing something brand new, there's nothing else in the market doing what we're doing. Our number one objective really was just to close the deals. So first of all, we started off with a few corner stores, which we gave our service to for free to demonstrate that the Food Waste Heroes program, so that's our program with volunteers collecting, redistributing surplus food, to demonstrate that the product worked. Then our first sort of real client was Planet Organic, who I think at the time had 7 stores in London. And then we were able to secure Pret a Manger for just over 100 stores. And then eventually we secured Tesco with 2,700 stores, which was the big whale for us. And we initially have approached pricing, I guess, with sort of two lenses. One is that unfortunately we're competing against the bin. We're competing against waste streams. And we know that to win the business, we have got to be at least on parity in terms of price with the bin, or ideally, we have to be delivering cost savings to our clients. So that has really, I guess, set the ceiling of what we can charge. Now, separate point about how waste streams are far too cheap in this country. For now, that's the reality with which we are battling. And then the other thing really is about pricing to win the deal, because in particular for enterprise clients, the opportunity to work with them will only come to market every couple of years. And so if you miss that boat, then you've missed that opportunity. So we would always kind of price to win. So I guess all of that goes to say that in the early days, we just thought it was much more important to win the deal than to maximize revenues. And one of our investors who was on our board had a wonderful expression, which is a bit gross, but he said, "You need to lick the cookies," by which he means you've just got to get in there, get in bed with those businesses. You've got to lick that cookie so that it is yours. And then you can think about eating the rest of the cookie a bit further down the line, price maximization further down the line. The other thing that we've done with regards to pricing was originally we also calculated our cost, right? Like how much does it actually cost us to deliver our service? So we're looking at what's the ceiling that we can charge, and then how much does it cost us to deliver per volunteer pickup. And originally we priced the business on a per volunteer pickup basis, but then we realized a couple of things. One, it meant that the amount we were charging each month was quite variable. And so that was complicated for us and for the client. And it meant they didn't have consistency from a budgeting perspective. But then also, because we were charging on a variable basis, it meant that actually they were almost disincentivized from using the product frequently. And so we transitioned to a monthly flat fee, essentially, which then meant that our clients were incentivized to use the product as much as possible, as much as they would like. And for us, that also worked really well, because that then made sure that we were maximizing impact. It meant that clients were giving away as much food as possible onto our platform. And eventually, we anticipate that we will get more sophisticated even in our pricing. So we do have different pricing according to scale. Like if you have one location versus 2,500 locations, you're going to pay a very different price on a per location basis. And then we do also do different pricing according to industry vertical, because again, so the economics in the verticals are very different. But eventually we want to get to a stage where we have more of a tiered pricing, so you can unlock additional kind of bells and whistles the more you pay. But we're honestly not there yet. And I think the other reality of early stage pricing is, again, you just do whatever you have to do to win the deal. That then means that operationally you can inherit a bit of a mess. And we're just going through that process now of just cleaning up that mess of all these different clients, all these different contracts and approaches, and sort of standardizing, which is much easier to do now that we're really well established and well known and we've got a fantastic reputation.
Yeah, I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because oftentimes what I've found is, when you do price yourself relatively low to the value that you're providing, it can be quite challenging to then go and increase the pricing. I guess now that you're established, you have better positioning in order to do that. But just
Yeah.
curious, in your journey, as you've tried to, I don't know, navigate price increases,
Mm-hmm.
any tips, advice around that in
I
particular?
think you need to understand a couple of things. So, one, what is your competitor? So if you have a direct competitor who's going to undercut you, it makes it much harder to increase the prices. And then two, you really do need to, if you haven't got a competitor, like we haven't directly got a competitor, you then need to look at your churn rate and look at, if a client has gone through a process of rolling out your service, what is the probability that they're then going to unroll it out and communicate to everybody that they are now throwing away their food again? It's not really something that businesses are going to want to do. So that is very helpful. Another reason why for us, we just wanted to get a foot in the door, build the relationships and take it from there. But if you do want to increase prices, you've got to have a story and a narrative as to why you're doing that. And we would always attach that to kind of additional value that we are adding improvements to our products and services.
Yeah. And I think, like you had mentioned earlier, sometimes your competition is actually not what you think it is. I
Yeah.
remember at Uber, the competition wasn't like maybe a cab, it was actually people working at McDonald's, like at the time, because people would be, that was minimum wage in quote. Like people
Yeah.
could easily get their car and then just try to, drive it to get a few bucks. So in your case, the alternative, like the competition was the bin.
Yes.
It's like sometimes maybe your competition is not what you think it is, and you have
Yeah.
to really think about
Absolutely.
that as well. The other thing I wanted to ask was, with a mission driven product or a product that's trying to do some good in this world, there's this misconception that you have to trade off one for the other. If you're doing impact, you
Mm.
can't do something that is commercially viable. I would love for you to talk about expressions of that tension in ways that we might not even expect, as more, maybe even a superpower, ways you were able to create
Mm.
even more value across both in your journey with Olio.
Yeah, so I get incredibly frustrated by the dichotomy that currently exists, where we basically believe here in the UK that if you are doing good, you need to be a charity, but you're probably not having impact at scale. And if you are growing like crazy and operating at scale, then you're probably having all sorts of negative externalities, but you are a business. And we believe very firmly at Olio that there needs to be a new path, a third path, which is profit with purpose. And why should businesses exist if they are not having a positive impact at some point on people and on planet? And more customers and employees are coming around to that way of thinking as well. And we sometimes find that people quite naturally want to frame profit and purpose as being in conflict with one another. But for us at Olio, those two things grow in lockstep with one another because our impact is not sort of an add on, it is core and fundamental to the business model. And so for us, the more food we redistribute, that is, the more impact we are having, but also we are being paid to redistribute that food. So the more food we are redistributing, the more revenues we are generating. Because that sort of sits at the heart of the business and the business model, it's not just a sort of an addendum that's tacked on, then we see profit and impact as being mutually reinforcing. And an analogy that I like to use is, if you think back to, I don't know, kind of the 90s and the early 2000s, people were often asked, "Oh, how do you deal with treating your employees well and managing your profitability and your growth? How do you be a good employer and also be commercially sound?" And we've now moved beyond that conversation, putting those two things in conflict with one another. We know that the most successful businesses invest in their employees and treat them really well, and that is what leads to further commercial success. So I really hope that in 5 years time no one will ask me about the trade-off between profit and purpose, because we've all realized that the
Yeah.
two are mutually reinforcing.
I
And
love it. And I know that you're also B Corp certified. So I
Yes.
would love to hear a little bit about what that means for you, and maybe for some of our viewers who don't know what it is, just
Yeah.
maybe the mental models of building a business with that in mind.
Yeah. So the B Corp movement is an amazing movement. I strongly recommend that everyone checks it out. I think in the UK there are over 3,000 companies that are now B Corps. And what it means to be a B Corp is, on a practical level, you change the articles of association of your company. So they're the kind of the founding documents. And you insert into your founding documents the sort of B Corp wording, which essentially says that the responsibility of the company directors is not to maximize profit for shareholders, but that the responsibility of a company directors is to align the interests of people, planet, and profit. And you also bake your company's mission into your articles of association so that your company can't be taken over by a bad actor and have its purpose changed and undermined. So you make an amendment to your company documents, and then you also have to go through a pretty rigorous certification process that the B Corp has set up, and you need to achieve a certain score in order to be a B Corp. Now, I should say that when we founded Olio and in the early days, we did not apply to become a B Corp because we were a tiny startup with no time, no resources. It was bleeding obvious that what we were doing is a good thing, and we felt that we did not need sort of a seal of approval from someone else to say that what you're doing is a good thing. However, once we started to get to a scale and we did have a bit more resources, we recognized that this was absolutely a helpful certification to have, and it's a fantastic community to be part of. So I would definitely recommend that businesses check it out, but choose when is the right time for you in your journey to apply and get certified.
love it. Cool. I guess one thing that we always love to do is just looking back at your journey. In hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Honestly, the honest answer is no, because hindsight's a wonderful thing, and I know that in the moment we did the best that we could with the information that we had available. And I'm also quite a big believer in karma. Everything happens for a reason. Wouldn't be where we were today were it not for many of those mistakes that we made. If I did have one macro reflection, I think that, certainly I speak for myself, I was too idealistic as a founder. I could see this enormous existential problem for humanity. And I could see that we clearly had an amazing solution. And we went to market with that solution using language all around solving the climate crisis. And unfortunately, that just doesn't resonate with most people. And so what we have had to do in recent years is flip our messaging hierarchy and not sort of bang on about the climate, but instead we talk about sort of what's in it for you, whether you be a corporate and how Olio is helping generate revenues or save money. And for an individual using Olio in the home, we talk about how great it is to share. Then we talk about the social impact that we're having, which we find, especially during a cost of living crisis, is really motivating to people. And then we don't really talk about the climate impact so much anymore. One, because I think that's fairly obvious. And two, it just doesn't motivate people to take action. So I think we should have dropped our idealism and got more realistic about where people were and meet them where they are earlier than we did.
I love it. I love it. And then maybe to wrap up, you have already shared some resources. We'll add that to the notes for the founders to check out. But if you could speak to one founder today, or maybe even yourself 10 years ago, something you needed to hear just as you took the leap. You've already mentioned the idealism bit, but if there was something you could go back in time, just speak to Tessa. You have 10 seconds. Just give her something for her journey. What would that be?
I would definitely say that without a shadow of a doubt, sort of co-founding Olio is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Sort of, on a par with marrying my husband and having my kids, like founding Olio. And that's for two reasons. One, waking up every single day, having worked with impact is so fulfilling. It's like, I know that I can lie on my deathbed and be proud of what I've done. And many people can't say that. And then secondly, just being master of your own destiny, being able to construct your days and your weeks how you want without some sort of corporate overlord is just amazingly liberating. So I would definitely sell the upsides, but I would also sort of caution and just remind anyone that it's not actually about those massive giant leaps. It is just about taking lots and lots of small steps day in, day out. You wake up, get punched in the face, go to sleep, wake up, get punched in the face, go to sleep, and just keep doing that on rinse, wash, and repeat. And you will eventually get there.
I love it.
I love that.
Thank you so much.
Leave a review. Tell us what you think of this episode on all our platforms at the Startup Leap Pod. Do you have a question? Ask us and we'll ask our guest. Go to thestartupleap.io. See you next time.